It was Christmas night, and the snow was falling so softly, it almost looked peaceful. I stood at the door, holding the small pie I had baked that morning, the same way I had every year since my son was little. The windows glowed with warm light, laughter spilled out into the cold air, and for a moment I thought maybe this Christmas would feel like the old ones again. But when the door opened, the warmth stopped at the threshold. He looked at me with eyes I barely recognized and said, "There's no place for you at the table." I thought he was joking. I even smiled, waiting for the laughter to follow, but his face didn't change. Behind him stood his wife, arms crossed, watching me like I was someone who didn't belong. I waited for someone to speak up, to say there was a mistake, but no one did. The pie in my hands felt heavier by the second. I nodded slowly, trying to hold what was left of my dignity, and said, "I understand." Then I turned away, listening to the sound of the door closing behind me as I stepped back into the cold night. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just kept walking, thinking how strange it is when love disappears without saying goodbye. Thank you for watching my story tonight. It means more to me than you know. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far my words travel on nights like this. My name is Rose, and I live in Alaska, where winters are long, quiet, and honest. The snow here has a way of reflecting truth, even when you try to hide from it. I've spent most of my life in this small town surrounded by mountains and frozen lakes, raising my son on my own after his father passed away when he was still young. Life wasn't easy, but I never minded the struggle. I worked long hours, came home to cook warm meals, and did everything I could to make him feel loved and safe. Back then, Christmas was our favorite day of the year. I would wake up early to bake cinnamon rolls, hang the stockings by the fireplace, and light the same vanilla candle every December 24th, the one his father had given me before he left this world. Every year, that candle burned beside a picture of the three of us smiling in front of a tree we could barely afford but always found a way to decorate. As the years passed, my son grew taller, busier, and quieter, and our holidays changed. The first year he got married, I told myself it was normal to feel left out a little. Families expand, I thought, and space gets tighter, but hearts don't. At least that's what I believed. The first Christmas after his wedding, he called me the morning of, said they were running late but would stop by later in the evening. I stayed up waiting, cinnamon rolls on the counter, lights still twinkling past midnight. They never came. He called the next day, said things had been hectic, promised the next year would be different. I forgave it, because that's what mothers do. Then came the next year, and the one after that, each one colder than the last. Sometimes I'd wrap small gifts for them, thinking maybe this would be the one they'd remember. A scarf I knitted, a photo album from when he was little, simple things that carried memories money could never buy. He always thanked me politely, but his wife never looked me in the eye. I noticed how she rearranged her schedule whenever I mentioned visiting, how the tone in her voice changed when I called. I tried to ignore it, hoping time would soften her heart. But time doesn't always heal, sometimes it just reveals. So this year, when he invited me for Christmas dinner, I told myself it was a sign that things were turning around. I spent days preparing, made his favorite pie, the same recipe from his childhood, the one he used to beg for every winter. I wrapped gifts for the children, polished my old shoes, and even ironed the red sweater he had bought me years ago when times were good. That morning, I stood by the window, watching the snow fall, whispering a prayer of gratitude. I believed that night would bring back everything I had been missing. But standing outside that glowing house, holding that warm pie in my hands, and hearing those words, "There's no place for you at the table," something inside me went still. I walked home through the snow, each step heavy but certain. The night sky so quiet, it almost felt like it was listening. By the time I reached my door, I knew this Christmas would change everything. When I stepped inside my house that night, the quiet felt heavier than the cold outside. The walls seemed to remember laughter that wasn't there anymore, and every sound in the room echoed too long, like it was trying to fill the space where joy used to live. I set the pie on the counter, still warm, untouched, and stood there staring at it for a moment. It looked perfect. Golden crust, sugared edges, and yet it meant nothing now. I pulled off my coat, hung it by the door, and turned on the small lamp in the living room. Its light was soft and yellow, touching the framed pictures of my son as a little boy. His face smiled back at me from years that felt like another lifetime. I remember the day we took that picture. He had lost his first tooth and insisted on holding the family dog so tight it nearly squirmed out of his arms. I can still hear his laugh in my mind, that bright sound that used to fill this whole house. I walked to the window and looked out. Snowflakes were swirling under the streetlight, slow and graceful. The world outside looked beautiful. But inside, something inside me had broken quietly, like glass cracking under pressure. I made a cup of tea, though I didn't drink much of it. The taste of it was bitter, not because of the tea, but because I kept replaying his voice in my head, that same tone he used when he said there's no place for you. I wondered when that change began, when I stopped being someone he needed and became someone he avoided. Maybe it was gradual, like frost forming on a window, first invisible, then impossible to ignore. As I sat in my rocking chair, the same one where I once held him close when he was sick, I traced the wooden arms with my fingers and tried to remember the last time he hugged me without distance in his eyes. I had given him everything I could, my time, my savings, my home. When he and his wife first bought their house, it was my signature on the final paper that made it possible. I wanted him to have security, to have a place where his family could grow. I never thought that kindness would turn into a reminder that I was no longer part of it. But life has a way of teaching you lessons in silence. I thought about the candle I used to light every Christmas Eve, the one that burned beside our family photo. I still had it tucked away in the drawer. I took it out, lit the wick, and watched the flame flicker. It danced softly, like a memory refusing to die. I sat there in the quiet, watching that little light, and for the first time in many years, I realized I had spent too long waiting for someone else to make me feel like I belonged. That night, something inside me shifted. Not in anger, but in clarity. I understood that love is not proven by invitation or gifts, it's shown by presence, by care, by respect. And once those are gone, no table in the world can make up for their absence. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened to the faint hum of the wind against the window. It wasn't a sound of loneliness anymore, it was the sound of truth. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was the end of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. And though the pain still burned, beneath it was something else, something steady. It was peace, the kind that only comes when you finally stop chasing what refuses to meet you halfway. The next morning, the light crept through my curtains like it was unsure of whether it was welcome. I sat at the table with a half cup of cold coffee, staring at the quiet around me. The pie was still on the counter, untouched, the same way I had left it the night before. I thought about throwing it away, but somehow I couldn't. It felt like a symbol of something I had tried so hard to hold on to. A piece of love that no one wanted, but I couldn't bring myself to waste. The clock ticked softly on the wall, and the sound of it filled the emptiness. I remember thinking how strange it is that time keeps moving, even when your heart feels like it's standing still. I looked out the window and saw the mailman's tracks already covered by fresh snow. The world outside was so calm, so perfectly white, and yet inside me there was a storm that wouldn't settle. I thought about calling him, not to argue, but just to ask what happened to us. Then I stopped myself. I had done enough reaching. I had spent years bending, apologizing, and explaining things I didn't even do wrong, hoping it would make someone love me better. But love that has to be begged for is no love at all. I took a slow breath, feeling the air sting my chest, and said quietly to myself, enough. As I sat there, I thought back to all the sacrifices I had made over the years. Every extra shift I worked so he could have what he needed, every time I stayed up late, helping him with school projects, every small joy I gave up so he could chase bigger ones. I remembered his first apartment, how proud he was, how I had slipped him some extra money for rent without telling him it came from my savings. I had built my entire world around his happiness. But that morning, sitting in my small kitchen surrounded by memories that no longer comforted me, I realized that I had never built a world of my own. I had been living through his life, not living mine. I stood up and walked slowly to the living room, where the candle from the night before still sat on the table. Its wax had hardened, but the wick was still blackened from the flame. I ran my fingers over it and smiled faintly. There was something final about the way it had burned out, like it had done its job and was ready to rest. I looked at the stack of papers on my shelf, old documents I hadn't touched in years. Among them was the folder I kept after I helped my son buy his home, the same home he now shared with his wife. I remembered the way he hugged me after signing those papers, told me I was the reason his dreams came true. I never told him that the house was still in my name, that the contract was written to protect him if anything ever went wrong. I never thought he'd become the reason I'd need that protection. I sat back down, hands folded, heart steady. The pain hadn't disappeared, but something stronger had taken its place. I wasn't going to fight for a place at anyone's table anymore. I had built that table with my own hands, and I could just as easily walk away from it. That morning, as the snow fell quietly outside, I decided that my silence would no longer be weakness. It would be the beginning of my strength. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew it would be peaceful, thoughtful, and final. Because sometimes, the most powerful actions come from the quietest hearts. As the day went on, I found myself moving slowly through the house, touching things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The old photos on the shelf, the cracked teacup I couldn't bring myself to throw away, the blanket I had knitted when the winters used to feel longer but somehow warmer. Each thing held a story, a piece of me that had been forgotten under years of trying to please everyone else. I opened the window a little, letting in the cold air. It filled the room with that sharp smell of snow and pine, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like clarity, like the air itself was cleansing everything that had been weighing me down. I sat back in my chair and whispered to myself that this house might be empty, but it was still mine. And tonight, that meant something again. I thought about the night before and how I had walked away without a word. Part of me wanted to believe that silence had power, but another part of me wondered if they even noticed I was gone. Maybe they laughed, maybe they carried on like nothing happened, maybe my empty chair wasn't empty to them at all. It was simply replaced. The thought hurt, but it didn't break me. It made something inside me stronger. I realized that sometimes life takes you through heartbreak, not to make you bitter, but to wake you up. I had spent years teaching him how to stand tall, how to be kind, how to show gratitude, but somewhere along the way, I forgot to teach myself that I deserved those same things in return. By afternoon, I was sorting through the drawer where I kept my important papers. The folder with the house contract sat there, right where I had left it. I ran my hand over it, remembering the day we signed it together. How happy he looked, how proud I was. I thought about how easily I had given him that home, thinking it would help him start a life of his own, never realizing how quickly I would be written out of that life. I smiled softly to myself, not with anger, but with understanding. Life has a strange way of returning lessons when you least expect them. And this one had come wrapped in snow and silence. I brewed another cup of tea and sat by the window again. The world outside was still white, quiet, almost sacred. I thought about the letter I would write. Not one filled with anger or blame, but one filled with truth. Words that didn't need to wound, only to reveal. Because some truths don't need to shout, they only need to be written once and left where they can't be ignored. I wanted every sentence to remind him not just of what he had lost, but of what he had taken for granted. The kindness, the sacrifices, the love that had always been waiting right behind him, unappreciated but constant. As the evening sky began to fade into shades of blue and gray, I felt calm, almost peaceful. The decision had already been made in my heart, even before I picked up the pen. There was no more pleading, no more hoping someone would change. I had done my part as a mother, as a giver, as someone who had loved without conditions. Now it was time to stand quietly in my own worth. Tomorrow, I would deliver that letter, and with it, close a door that should have been closed long ago. Not out of revenge, but out of love for myself. The woman who had spent a lifetime building others' happiness and had finally remembered she deserved her own. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I was restless, but because my mind was clear for the first time in a long while. I sat by the window with the candle burning low, watching the snow fall in thick, quiet sheets, each flake drifting down like a small piece of forgiveness. I thought about how strange it was that peace can arrive on the same night that heartbreak does. How sometimes they come hand in hand, and you just have to decide which one to hold on to. The clock ticked softly in the corner, the kind of sound that feels almost alive when the world is silent. I looked around the house, at the small things that once filled it with love, and realized they were still here. Love hadn't disappeared completely, it had just changed its shape. I opened the drawer again and pulled out a piece of stationery, the same kind I used years ago to write letters to my husband when he was away working. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and it smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I placed it on the table and sat for a while before writing anything. I wanted to be sure my words would come from strength, not pain. I wanted him to read it and feel not just the weight of his choices, but the quiet power of mine. I started the first line slowly, the pen moving gently across the paper. The words flowed easier than I expected. I wrote about the memories, the laughter, and the years of sacrifice that built the life he now lived. I reminded him that his home wasn't just a house, it was made possible by my hard work and love. And then, carefully, I wrote the line that would change everything. The one that came straight from a heart that had finally stopped breaking. I told him he would need to find a new place to celebrate next year, because this one was no longer his to claim. I paused and read it back, not to see if it sounded right, but to feel if it felt true. It did. I wasn't writing out of bitterness, and that surprised me. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to teach him, one last time, the lesson I had hoped life would teach him sooner. Never take the hands that built you for granted. I folded the letter neatly, tied it with a thin red ribbon I had kept from an old Christmas gift, and placed it beside my purse so I wouldn't forget it in the morning. The candle flickered beside me, and for a moment I saw his face in the flame, not the man who closed the door on me, but the little boy who used to run to me when he was scared of thunder. For a brief moment my eyes stung with tears, but I let them fall quietly. It wasn't grief anymore. It was release. Before going to bed, I stepped outside for a moment. The night was cold, crisp, and still. The stars looked like tiny pieces of glass scattered across the dark sky, and the snow on the ground sparkled under them, like it was trying to remind the world that beauty can still exist after pain. I took a deep breath, feeling it fill my lungs, and whispered a small prayer into the air, not for him, but for me. That I would have the courage to let go without looking back. When I went inside, I blew out the candle and stood in the darkness for a few seconds, listening to the echo of my own breath. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. And as I laid down that night, I knew that tomorrow would mark not an ending, but the beginning of my peace. When morning came, the world outside was covered in a thick, soft blanket of snow, the kind that made everything look new again. I got dressed slowly, wrapped my scarf around my neck, and took one last look around my little house before stepping out. The letter rested carefully in my gloved hand, its ribbon tucked neatly in place. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that wakes you up and reminds you that life still moves, no matter what happened the night before. My boots crunched against the snow with each step, and for the first time in years, every sound felt certain, deliberate, and peaceful. I wasn't walking away from love. I was walking toward respect, my own. When I reached his house, the driveway was still, the curtains closed, and not a single light glowed inside. I stood there for a moment, remembering all the years I had walked through that same door carrying gifts, laughter, and hope. This time, I carried truth. I bent down slowly and placed the letter against the door, right where he would see it the moment he stepped outside. For a second, I wanted to knock, maybe say goodbye, but I stopped myself. Some words speak louder when they are left unread until morning. I took a deep breath, looked at that house one last time, and whispered quietly, "Merry Christmas." Then I turned around, letting the snow erase my footsteps as I walked away, feeling lighter with every step. By the time I got back home, the morning sun had started to rise, stretching long golden lines across the snow. The world was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that hurts. It was the kind that lets you breathe again. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the light grow stronger by the minute. Somewhere out there, that letter was waiting to be found. And though I didn't know exactly when he would open the door, I knew that the moment would change everything. I didn't feel nervous or guilty, only calm, as if the weight I had carried for years had finally lifted. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't wondering what he thought of me, or whether he would ever understand what I felt. I had already said everything that needed to be said, without raising my voice, without bitterness, just truth written in ink and tied with ribbon. As I took a sip of my tea, I thought about how life often gives us chances to speak, and how sometimes silence does it better. The sun touched the frosted glass of my window, and I smiled, knowing that somewhere across town, the same light was beginning to reach his doorstep. He would see the letter, pick it up, and for the first time in years, he would have to stop and listen to words that couldn't be ignored. I didn't write them to hurt him. I wrote them so he could finally see me, not as someone to set aside, but as the woman who had given him everything and asked for nothing but kindness in return. I set the cup down, leaned back in my chair, and let the warmth fill me. Whatever happened next wasn't mine to carry anymore. I had already done my part, and peace, sweet and quiet, finally felt like home. Not long after, as I sat in that same chair by the window, I could almost imagine the moment he opened the door. The sound of it creaking, the soft brush of snow falling from the frame, the confusion when his eyes caught sight of the small envelope resting against the step. I pictured him bending down, picking it up, and seeing my handwriting, the same handwriting that had once signed his school forms and birthday cards. For a moment, he would probably think it was a simple note, maybe an apology or a wish for peace, but as he read the first few lines, I knew his heart would start to race. I could almost feel it, that wave of shock washing over him when he reached the line that told him he would need to find a new home next Christmas. The home he thought was his, the one built on my sacrifices, had never really been his to claim. I imagined the silence that followed, the kind that feels like the world has stopped spinning for a second. Then the sound of his voice breaking it, sharp and desperate, calling my name, as if I would suddenly appear and take it all back. I knew there would be shouting, maybe even tears, confusion that would turn to anger, then disbelief, and finally regret. His wife would ask what it meant, her voice tight with fear, and he would realize how deep his mistake had gone, how far his choices had pushed me away. But I wouldn't be there to hear it. I didn't want to hear it. Some lessons are meant to be learned in the silence left behind by the one you took for granted. As I looked out at the quiet, snow-covered street, I didn't feel joy or revenge, only stillness. The kind that comes when justice isn't loud but steady. I had not done this to punish him, but to remind him of what love really costs when it's ignored. A part of me hoped that one day, when the anger settled and pride no longer stood between us, he would understand, that he would remember the warmth he once knew, and realize that every decision I made came from love, even the hardest one. I took another sip of tea, closed my eyes, and let the peace sink in deeper. Sometimes, silence doesn't mean the story is over. It means the truth has finally been spoken. As the hours passed, I stayed by the window, watching the light shift across the snow until it turned the color of fading gold. Somewhere out there, I knew he was still trying to make sense of what had happened, pacing through the rooms that once felt like his own, realizing how fragile ownership becomes when respect is forgotten. I could picture him sitting at the kitchen table, the same one I had chosen and paid for, running his hand through his hair as he read that letter over and over, hoping the words might change if he looked at them long enough. But they wouldn't. They were written with finality, with a calm that even anger couldn't erase. And maybe that calm would be what unsettled him the most, because for years, he had mistaken my gentleness for weakness, never understanding that silence has a strength of its own. I imagined his wife trying to speak, her voice low, her words tripping over guilt or denial, but there would be nothing left to say. The truth was sitting right there on that table, wrapped in a red ribbon that once tied up his childhood gifts. That same ribbon now held the moment that divided the past from the future. I didn't smile thinking about it, but I did breathe easier. Life has a way of returning balance, even when it takes the long road to get there. I wasn't celebrating his pain. I was simply accepting my peace. Outside, the wind began to pick up, brushing against the window in soft sighs. I stood, stretched, and looked around my quiet home. It no longer felt empty. It felt like a place that finally belonged to me again. A space no longer heavy with waiting or disappointment. I lit another candle, not out of sadness this time, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that I had found my courage before time slipped too far away. Gratitude that I had spoken without shouting, and that I had chosen peace over bitterness. The flame flickered gently, casting small waves of light against the walls, and in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet pride in myself. I had finally remembered who I was beyond the title of mother, beyond the expectations, beyond the giving. I was Rose, and I had survived another winter, not through others' love, but through my own strength. Later that evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of blue, and the quiet of night began to settle over the town, I sat near the fireplace with a blanket around my shoulders and thought about how strange life can be. One day, you're holding someone's hand, guiding them through the world, and before you realize it, they're pushing that hand away, thinking they no longer need its warmth. I had spent so many years believing that my purpose was to give, to comfort, to forgive, and somewhere along the line, I forgot that I deserved comfort too. But sitting there, hearing the fire crackle softly, I understood that love should never be one-sided, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is to step back and let someone face the mirror of their own choices. I thought about the house across town, the one now filled with confusion and regret. I could almost picture him sitting alone, the letter folded beside him, the silence growing heavier with each hour. Maybe he would finally remember all the Christmas mornings when I woke before dawn to make his favorite breakfast, or the nights I stayed up sewing his torn jacket so he wouldn't be cold walking to school. Maybe, just maybe, he would realize that love doesn't vanish overnight, it fades slowly, each time gratitude is forgotten. I didn't wish him pain, only understanding, because without it, no heart ever truly grows. The longer I sat there, the more I realized that forgiveness doesn't always mean returning. Sometimes it means letting go so you can breathe again. I didn't hate him. I couldn't. Hate is too heavy to carry, and I had carried enough already. What I felt instead was peace, a quiet acceptance that the story between us had changed. The bond of blood may remain, but the bond of trust had to be rebuilt, if it ever would be. I leaned back, watching the soft shadows move along the walls, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the ache of being unwanted. I felt free, steady, and whole. Tomorrow would come with new light, and I would meet it without fear. Because even after heartbreak, life continues to bloom if you choose to water it with strength instead of sorrow. The next morning came quietly, with soft light spilling through the curtains and the faint hum of the wind brushing against the windows. I sat at the kitchen table with a warm cup of tea, feeling the peace that had settled deep inside me. There was no sadness anymore, just a gentle calm, the kind that comes when you finally make peace with what has already passed. I thought about everything that had led me here, every moment I had doubted myself, every time I had chosen silence over anger, and I realized that I had done the right thing. I had kept my dignity, even when it would have been easier to lose it. I had chosen truth, even when it broke my heart to write it. And most of all, I had chosen myself, after years of choosing everyone else. As I looked out at the snow-covered trees swaying in the morning light, I thought about how endings can sometimes look like beginnings in disguise. Maybe one day, he would understand the meaning behind that letter. Maybe he would see that it wasn't written out of revenge, but out of love. The kind of love that finally learns when to stop giving to those who only take. I smiled softly, because I knew that no matter what he felt now, those words would stay with him. They would follow him through the seasons, through the quiet moments, and one day, when pride no longer stood in the way, he would know that his mother didn't walk away. She simply stood up for herself. I took another sip of tea, the warmth spreading through my chest, and whispered to myself that peace is a home you build within, not one you wait for someone else to offer. I had spent years waiting to be seen. But that morning, I saw myself clearly for the first time. The wrinkles on my hands, the silver in my hair, the strength in my still heart, all of it told the story of a woman who loved deeply, lost quietly, and found her strength without shouting. I picked up my knitting basket and began to work. Each stitch slow and steady, the rhythm comforting. Life was still here, soft and full of second chances, and I was ready to meet it with grace. The candle flickered beside me, and as I watched its gentle flame, I realized something simple but true. Peace is not given, it's chosen, and I had finally chosen mine. As the days slowly faded into evening, the sky turned a soft shade of rose and gold, and the world outside grew quiet again. I sat by the window, watching the snow settle over the trees like a blanket, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not the kind that comes from getting what you want, but the kind that grows when you finally let go of what hurt you. I thought about everything that had happened, about how pain had turned into strength, and how silence had become my loudest truth. There was no anger left in me, only gratitude, because even though the lesson had been hard, it had given me back my voice, my peace, and my power. Sometimes life has to break your heart just enough to remind you that it still beats, and that it can still lead you home. I sat there for a long while, the candle burning low beside me, and whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone else, but to life itself, for teaching me that it's never too late to choose yourself. I smiled softly, knowing that this story wasn't about losing family, it was about finding peace in honesty. I looked into the flicker of that candle and felt warmth rise in my chest, the kind that comes when you finally know who you are, even when others don't. And now, my dear ones, thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If it touched your heart, or reminded you that strength can be quiet and love can still stand tall after disappointment, please subscribe, share this story, and tell me what part of it spoke to you the most. Until next time, take care of your heart, keep your peace, and never forget, you are stronger than you think.